Um, in keeping with my past stories about heroes in the family, I have thought of another one to enter in on that list of heroes. This one is a woman. She would be my aunt, Aunt Carol. It may be self-serving in a way because she was my surrogate mother to begin with, but she led such a great life that she became one of my heroes. Now let's begin with, I think I've told in other stories about when I was born, just a few months before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and I moved with my family as a baby to Wichita, where my dad got recruited to work for Boeing Aircraft. When we got there, when we arrived in Wichita, my mother found out that they were in such need for help at the Boeing plant that she wanted to also start working there. But daycare was unheard of, and she had me, which was like maybe 6 months old, and my sister, who was a little bit older, but she hadn't quite started school yet. So she decided to recruit herself, called home to her kid sister, my Aunt Carol, who was, I believe, a sophomore in high school. I know she hadn't graduated high school and she had 2 years to go. She dropped everything and moved to Wichita to be with us and to take care of me and my sister. And my mother went to work at the plant also. Now, Carol turned out to be probably the perfect daycare person for me. She became my mother because my mother and dad both had the same problem. Boeing's shifts were, you worked a 60-hour week. Now this is wartime, so that wasn't unusual. 10-hour days, 6 days a week. The plant did shut down on Sundays. So I spent at least a 10-hour day, of course they had travel time too in there, with Carol. So that's why I called her my surrogate mother for those years. Carol showed signs of brilliance already then, and she had not even graduated from high school. She became a good cook because she had to cook for me and my sister, but also she cooked the supper meals and always made sure they were ready when my parents got home from work. She devised a scheme at that time. I don't know if a scheme is a good word for it, but there was a thing called food rationing at that time. The government issued everybody stamps, and you couldn't use more than what they issued. That way they could control the food economy to make sure they could feed the soldiers overseas and so forth, so that they could control it. It was a good program. But Carol was cooking for already a family of, well, there would have been 5 of us with her. And Dad was working as a foreman at Boeing, and he was liaison between the engineers and the people working assembly of the B-29s. And a lot of them were single guys. And there wasn't any good restaurants around. There were greasy spoon type of places, I guess. And these guys were all hungry for home-cooked meals. But they were being issued stamps also. So with Dad's help, Carol initiated this program where these guys could come and she would cook a home-made meal, good food, dessert, and everything with it, in exchange for their stamps, which made it possible
Telemarketer.
which made it possible for her to make better and bigger meals. It was a win-win situation. And Dad would recruit guys, and they were more than willing to turn in their stamps. So they didn't need them, they couldn't use them. And for a good home-cooked meal. She also, since my parents were both working 6-day weeks, they were off Sundays because the plant was closed. So that became Carol's day off. She didn't really take a day off. What she did was she became part of the USO program. And if you know anything about your history, USO programs were big in those days. Every city in the country of any size had programs where men in uniform could go and relax and have coffee and donuts primarily. So she started working Sundays at this USO making coffee and donuts and feeding the troops that were coming through. Boeing also used a lot of troops for security. They had their own security department, but they also had the Army guarding the place against saboteurs and so forth. Carol became interested in the University of Chicago through one of these guys, or I guess there was a couple of them. One of these engineers that Dad brought home. There was a couple of them that had been through got their engineering degree through the University of Chicago. And while they were eating and talking, she became enraptured with that school. And when the end of the war came and everybody decided to go home, everybody in the world seemed to be ready and willing to go home. All the GIs all over the world and all of the people serving in different places like the Boeing plant, everybody wanted to go home. My dad kicked himself several times for leaving Boeing. He would have had an excellent career there if he had stayed, but like everybody else, he wanted to go home. Carol wanted to go home also to see her father. She was very close to my grandfather. But she also decided she wanted to go to school in the University of Chicago. So she came home, told him of her plans, and he was all for it. And she had put it together a little bit of money, whatever my parents had paid her, because so did my parents put aside some money because there was nothing really to spend it on during the wartime. Gasoline was rationed, everything was rationed. So it was easy to save any money. And you also could turn it into war bonds and collect interest after the war. So with that nest egg, she took off for Chicago. You know, she would have been probably 18 or 19. No high school diploma as yet, but on her way to enroll in college. She got to Chicago, looked for an apartment, and was intelligent enough to look for a roommate. And she found one, a young girl named Doris, who became her lifelong friend. They got an apartment, and they both were experienced with food service. And so they went out and got a job at the same place, a restaurant.